It's really great to start with Dr. Paul Cross today, research ecologist with the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center.
Yep.
USGS. So Paul, intrigued to know that he did a bachelor's degree at University of Virginia, and then PhD at UC Berkeley. He's been just publishing a variety of important topics. I see he's in excess of 120 papers, many of them high profile. Most of this, it seems like his core theme is using mathematical modeling to try to understand disease. We'll tell us more about an overview of his background and his current problems. So with that, Paul, we really appreciate you coming and look forward to your talk.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Thanks everybody for coming. Right, as Andy said, I do sort of wildlife disease ecology, quantitative ecology at times for U.S. Geological Survey. I am in that Western Transportation building just back behind the football stadium. And so today we're going to talk about chronic wasting disease, which I think could be among these sort of larger issues that have had important impacts on the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Like there have been a number over its history, starting from like the Leopold Report on Natural Regulation in 1963 to the dump closures for grizzly bears in the late 60s, the 88 fires and wolf reintroductions. You know, certainly climate change will be on this list, but it's sort of like hard to pinpoint like a year in which that's happening. And we'll see if after this talk you consider that CWD might also be on this list for the future. So, I mean, obviously CWD is going to impact deer and elk, which are an important part of the ecosystem, but also for the social and ecological sort of side, the social and economic sides of things. Deer and elk are a pretty important part of the functioning of how this ecosystem works. Chronic wasting disease, it's spread over time from this core around the southeastern side of Wyoming and Colorado to across a large portion of North America now. It's a pathogenic prion that's infectious, that is basically a protein that is misshapen into a different three-dimensional form. And that form is then infectious by changing other proteins to that same conformation. And then that is then hard to degrade, both in the body of the host, but then also in the environment. So that leads to both this direct transmission between individuals, as well as this environmental transmission where there have been lab trials where we remove deer from an infected region or an infected pen, and then we introduce uninfected deer into that pen after 2 years of letting it sit with nobody in it, and then they can get infected as well. So that's what I mean by environmental transmission. It's very environmentally stable. We don't quite know how long it can live in the environment, live in the quotations. It's probably a very long time. Scrapie has had cases where sheep farms have been vacant for 18 years and then been reinfected when uninfected sheep have been put onto the same region. It's always fatal. So far as we know, there's no recovery. And the mortality times for deer and elk tend to be on this order of 2 to 5 years or so on average, and spreading geographically. So far, the management tools are really limited. There's no treatment, there's no vaccines. I think those are unlikely in the near term, particularly for this case where it's a prion where we have lots of other hurdles to make vaccines for prions that we don't have for other pathogens. And so the management options are largely around reducing deer and elk aggregations and, changing of hunting regulations are really the two tools that they have available to them at large scale in the wild. And those so far have been shown in some cases to reduce the rate of increase, but have not been sufficient to actually decrease prevalence over time. So it's still increasing, just more slowly in some areas than in other areas. So then we come to this area around the feed grounds. As you can see from this map, like it's been sort of coming into this area over time. And just in the last couple of years, it's been observed around in elk and Grand Teton National Park. It's been observed in mule deer and Yellowstone National Park now, but that's only within the last couple of years. It's still relatively low prevalence around the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But the real question here is what will happen in these Wyoming feed grounds, which are in the southern half of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There's 22 different sites, most of them state-run feed grounds, but also the National Elk Refuge, which is right outside Jackson. So that's a Fish and Wildlife Service operated location. So the real question is, what will those do over time as CWD invades those areas? And so what I'm going to do here is we're going to take a bit of a sort of a detour to then go back in time now to talk about like other disease research we've done around these feed grounds in advance of CWD coming here, and then bring us up to date of what we're currently doing around a number of different management decisions that are probably likely to have a big important effect on chronic wasting disease and on deer and elk in this ecosystem. The formation of these feed grounds goes back a long way. The original formation of the National Elk Refuge was, I believe, around 1906 to 1907 or so. And that was as elk populations were really low at that time, and there was like significant winter mortality. There was concern about just the perpetuation of having elk at all in the ecosystem. And so they established the National Elk Refuge for that purpose. Coincident with also having sort of land use change as settlers were coming into the area. And so there's a number of different reasons why these feed grounds have put in place, starting in 1907 up to the late 50s, most of them became established. So one reason is like the alleviation of severe winter mortality. But another one is that the state game agency, Wyoming Game and Fish Department, is responsible for mitigating big game damage on private property. And that can come in two forms, that elk, deer, or other big game are consuming haystacks, damaging private property, or it can be in the form of disease spillover between elk and cattle as another form. And that disease concern was not the original formation of some of these feed grounds. They were originally formed for other purposes, but due to the increased aggregation that these feed grounds allowed for, then we have some additional disease concerns that crop up over time. And then those have created another reason why they are continuing to be fed, that they have a disease that's enhanced by the aggregations that are created by the feed grounds, which is why we want to separate them from cattle. So we feed them and create this cycle of feeding, which creates a problem, which is why we need to keep feeding them. So this is one of those areas where just to the left of this picture is a feed ground that operates in the winter. This is Dell Creek Feed Ground, which we'll talk about a bunch. And just right next door is a cattle operation. And so one of the key concerns in this context is brucellosis. It's a bacteria called Brucella abortus in this case. It's an infection of cattle, elk, and bison around this region. It causes abortion events in females, and that's also how it is transmitted to others. That they abort infected fetuses out onto the landscape like this one. Another elk goes and investigates that, and then they become infected in that route. Historically was widespread across the United States in cattle and was a wide human health concern, and still is one of the most common zoonotic infections that people get, just not in the United States anymore because it's well controlled. But anywhere there are sort of pastoral societies that are living without pasteurization and other safety control measures, brucellosis is a very common infection. Previously common across the country, but now due to sort of the control efforts of USDA from 1950s to present, was cleaned up in the cattle herds across the country through test and remove predominantly, and then later on with a little bit of vaccination. And so now it's only present around the greater Yellowstone area. And that's probably for two reasons. One is that we had the elk feed grounds in place, and that perpetuated disease in that context. And then bison are a very good host as well. So historically it was thought of to be two primary issues, that it's a bison issue and it's an elk feed ground issue. But outside the feed grounds, elk were not really considered to be a particularly good host. And historically, were not a common host for brucellosis across the country. So we've done a large number of brucellosis studies over the time. We've done a lot of them in collaboration with MSU. We've had NSF grants with Scott Creel and others doing a whole list of these things. And some of my trajectories, I've always been trying to figure out like which projects actually sort of make a management impact. And many of these provide context for management of the decisions, but it's really hard to pinpoint like, did they actually like make an impact? Did they actually make a change? And only two of them are like really easy to identify, that like this one actually changed something about the context of that decision. And I'll talk a little bit about those in particular. The vaccine efficacy one had been done in the lab, but in the field it hadn't been analyzed. And so we just basically analyzed over time in a more ecological way. Could you show that there was any efficacy of the vaccine at a population level? And this is the vaccine vaccinating elk on the feed grounds. So they were putting the vaccine into a biobullet and then vaccinating almost 100% of all individuals on the feed grounds for many years. And over time, it wasn't set up in a great study dynamic because there was 20 different treatment sites and one control site. And that one control site happened to have other attributes that made it look as though the treatment was actually working relative to the control. But over time, they started to appreciate that this maybe wasn't working. And in fact, we sort of showed at a population level, the vaccine was not actually doing anything. So when the manufacturer was going to close down anyway, rather than manufacture their own, Game and Fish decided that maybe we shouldn't do the vaccine. So like a small contribution, but that was the vaccine efficacy study. The feeding and disease comparison across feed grounds started out as a sort of a correlational study of just looking at like, how are the feed grounds different from one another? There's lots of different ones and they differ in how they operate and how many elk are there. But they also differ in how long they're fed at different sites. And so this is an early study of just for each site is in different contexts of the amount of snow in that site. And so some sites just are naturally fed for longer than other sites. So some sites are fed into late April on average, and other sites are fed just up until mid-March with a start time somewhere between January and February. And so those sites that are fed for longer tend to have more brucellosis in them. The size of the dot here is sort of proportional to the sample size we had at that time. So it's relative to our confidence and our disease estimate for that analysis. But also, it's correlated with snowpack. So in this case, the snow water equivalent on the x-axis is correlated with how long they feed for. So it's a management decision, but it's constrained by the on-the-ground snowpack of that year. And so the black dots here, those sites those years that are more recent. So more recently, managers are trying to minimize their feeding as much as possible, but they're constrained by what the snowpack is of a given year and at a given site. So from this, And another study that we did with a master's student here, we did this study where we sort of worked with feed ground managers to feed one day in a very low density sort of way, which is additional work for them to do, versus the more traditional way where they just sort of dump hay off of the sled as fast as possible. And then we could measure what would be disease relevant contacts in these different contexts and could show that in the low density sort of treatment on the same site on one day versus another day, we could dramatically change the proportion of elk that would be encountering sort of abortion, like disease relevant contact unit. So from this and the previous study, that was enough for the Game and Fish Department to try to then do this at scale across many different feed grounds. Some feed grounds were better than others to do this on. Some feed grounds are very topographically constrained, so they can't really do low density feeding in the same way. But they tried to shorten the season on some to the extent that they could do it politically, and then they tried to expand the range. And that experiment, that sort of management experiment, did not sort of show the dramatic results that we hoped it would from this correlation. From this correlation, we were like, oh, you dropped the feeding by a month. That's a 2/3 reduction in prevalence there. So that's like quite dramatic. But we don't get that when we actually do the treatment trial. That correlation doesn't quite hold up. And part of the reason for that is this is the simplistic way we sort of conceptualize the early system, because brucellosis was not found in elk anywhere outside the feed ground. So like this is sort of our simplistic understanding, but there's more going on even in the absence of feeding. The aggregations that are necessary for brucellosis in elk to sort of operate are also driven by other factors outside the feed grounds as well. And even if we take away feeding, we still have aggregations that are generated by snow. Winter aggregations are larger than summer aggregations. Areas where we have snow, we still get aggregations, even when we're not feeding. That's also driven by population size. And population size in elk populations has been changing over the long sort of history of this region. And so that's also part of what happened off of the feed grounds themselves. So during the same time as we're doing this work on the feed grounds, we start noticing these trends in elk off of the feed grounds in other regions around the Yellowstone system. So historically, this is what we believe, that like prevalence is extremely low prior to the mid-2000s. Some of that's probably some false positives. Some of those are individuals that dispersed long distance from the feed grounds, but couldn't get the disease started, because at those times, the population size was 1/10 of what it is now in many of those regions. So the Madison area in the 70s to 80s, that was only a population size of about 600. And now it's like in the neighborhood of 6,000. So populations and aggregations have dramatically changed over the same time window. And the disease is basically sort of mirroring and catching up to those long-term changes as well. And so if we just sort of map our estimates in different points in time, we see what we thought in the 1990s, early 90s up to 2000. The disease is mostly present around the feed grounds. And given our sampling, this is what we can say. But by 2014, it's around the whole ecosystem. We can show genetically how the pathogen has moved primarily from the feed grounds to these other areas, as opposed to from bison inside the Yellowstone. They actually have entirely different lineage, probably a different introduction event from cattle. It's a European infection that came from cattle to wildlife originally. And then now it's a spillover back again. So in a way, it's really similar to what we're observing with SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, with deer as well, that we had it, gave it to deer, and now we're wondering what will be the spillover back again from this new source. The livestock cases are pretty rare, but they generally line up, with the same areas that you see where you observe elk. And that's primarily because bison are so constrained, they don't have that much overlap with other cattle herds. So the disease risk for cattle is all coming from elk. And the infections around the feed grounds are sort of comparable to other areas where you don't have feed grounds over the long term. So that's sort of like our drift back in time to like, this is what we were working on prior to CWD coming into the system. This is sort of how we understood the system in advance of CWD coming here. And now I'll tell you a little bit more about like, what are we thinking about with chronic wasting disease in this ecosystem? Still at low prevalence, which makes a lot of field studies really challenging. It's like, if you were to try to do field studies here on CWD now, you'd have a hard time getting positive individuals in any sample size that's logistically feasible. It is correlated with some population level declines, both in mule deer and white-tailed deer in Wyoming. I don't think we'll see the same thing in other systems that are more productive. Like a lot of the initial work has been done in the Midwest and in the East Coast. And those are just more productive systems for many different reasons. And so, and they're, much more abundant hosts and over, objective in many cases. And so I think the concerns are a little bit less in those contexts than in this context of the Rocky Mountain West, where things are much drier and the productivity of these herds is not nearly the same. Recently detected in both Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks now. And so potentially has this option of changing the discussion around the relative costs and benefits of the feed grounds themselves. We think that the population consequences of CWD might be much more significant than brucellosis for elk. And it's one on top of the other, both contributing to, population, maybe performance issues in deer and elk compared to just brucellosis. So that brings us to present day, where the Forest Service is currently deciding on 2 different feed grounds. And so their decision is whether or not to permit the state to feed on federal property. And they are currently obligated to reassess this Dell Creek and Forest Park feed ground. So one of those feed grounds, Dell Creek, it's like right here. And I'm sitting on the road taking this picture right about here, and this is the cattle operation that's right next door. So this is a highly agricultural cattle risk site. The other site, Forest Park, is in the middle of the Wyoming range and doesn't have the agricultural risk component, but very much has this component of having elk in an area that's not great winter range, and so could have very strong population consequences of not feeding them and then still coming to that site expecting to be fed, but then being an area which is not really winter range. So 2 contrasting sort of issues for these 2 different feed grounds coming up for the Forest Service. So one of many different feed grounds here at Forest Park and Dell Creek, 8 of those feed grounds are on Forest Service property. So they have to deal with the 2 now, but sort of like lurking in the background is they have 6 more that they have to authorize their permits for prior to 28. And so at the time that they're reevaluating the Forest Park and Dell Creek decision, I think also in the back of their mind is, to what extent is this precedent for how we might address those 6 others? And then you can see the National Elk Refuge is sort of a different scale, at around 8,300 individuals compared to many of the state-run feed grounds, which are about 1/10 of the size. So at the time that Forest Service is initiating this process, part of our role at USGS was to work with them on a very structured decision-making process to figure out how to tackle this problem. And so currently, I'm going to talk about that, but currently the draft EIS for Forest Park and Dell Creek is currently out. Public comment just closed, but they haven't decided what their actual preferred alternative is at the moment. So they're not yet at the record of decision. Okay, so This is all new to me, even though I do like applied work with federal agencies. I hadn't been quite this invested in an actual decision that was going to be made and what the process is for the federal agency to do that. As you all probably know, there's a NEPA Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, that requires federal agencies to do certain things and assess their impact before they do that. So they have to do these things. They have to decide on their purpose and need, what's the effective environment. They have to discuss what their potential alternatives would be and what are the consequences of doing those different alternatives. Then from there, they come to a record of decision, which is like the formal endpoint. But the decision analysis and structured decision-making has many of those same components. Sometimes we call them different things, but they're very similar. To understand what is the decision being made, what are your objectives, what are your alternatives, and then sort of assessing the consequences of all your alternatives against your objectives, and then coming to a decision. So what we're trying to do is essentially do a more formal decision analysis within the NEPA framework. And so the USGS sort of team brings in both the decision science support. We have many different decision scientists. One that we worked with here is John Cook. He's at Eastern Ecological Science Center. But then I'm coming in to help with that, as well as the sort of consequence analysis and the trade-off sort of analysis. So I'm sort of part of the technical team. And then we have other people that are sort of facilitators that are professionals in the structured decision-making process. So you work with the managers in this, and we work with the Forest Service to come up with what are all your objectives. And those objectives come from enabling legislation that they're required to do within their agency, as well as their forest plan. It's stipulated what they're supposed to be doing. And so from those, you derive from, from talking to them, what are you really trying to do? In some cases, this causes people some anxiety, these maximize and minimize, because usually managers are like, I don't really want to maximize that. I want to, because what they're thinking is that also has consequences at the upper end of the scale. So when we say maximize, we're saying maximize in the absence of any other impacts. And then the analysis is again going to figure out the trade-offs of like, okay, well, if it's really that far, then you're going to trade off against this other objective. And we will figure out what that balancing act is. But all other things equal, would you rather have more or less? And it's the all other things equal that's like the key part of like, maximize this, we want to minimize that. So Forest Service sort of decides what are the things that they're trying to do. These are all their objectives that might be affected by this decision. And then you go through, well, what are all the things that you could do? In this case, the Forest Service is a little bit constrained in the things that they are able to do that are within their jurisdiction. So our management alternatives here are pretty limited in their sort of range and flexibility. You don't see, there's no different hunting alternatives, because that is not within the jurisdiction of Forest Service to do. They have to negotiate that with the state agency to change their hunting regulations. So that's why you don't see some of those things here in the alternatives that the Forest Service was willing to consider. They are, do we release the permit again for a 20-year time period is what's typical? Do we not release the permit? Do we commit to a phase out? In this case, it was a 3-year phase out was what they were proposing. Or do we allow for some emergency feeding? And so then we have to talk about, well, what would the emergency feeding look like? What would be the trigger for doing that? And so we have to then it goes from sort of like the discussion around objectives and alternatives to sort of like, how do we address that in either a qualitative or quantitative framework? So in this case, I think we had the benefit of having been invested in the system for a long period of time. We already had a lot of that information and knowledge to do a more quantitative effort here than what is typical. So we already had like working CWD models. We already had lots of elk space use information. So what we did was we took a CWD model, and from that model, we're going to derive some metrics that are tied to their objectives. So we want to know about elk population size now and into the future, number hunted, CWD prevalence. From that model, we're going to dump that into a space use kind of model. We're going to get other metrics from that space use kind of model. We want to know about how elk are on private property, causing private property damage. We want to know about potential competition with other species. We want to know about elk abortions on private land because that's the brucellosis risk portion to livestock in the area. So from those, we can then derive some other metrics that they're after also. So some of the economics of like, how does this affect the license revenue for state game agencies? How does it affect regional economies? And how does this affect costs to ranchers? So that's the overall sort of structure of what we did. The CWD model, you know, it's a pretty traditional disease model, but then we have to do all these tailorings of that model to really address what the alternatives were. So we have to implement the phase out. We have to sort of account for how elk are going to move from feeding areas to non-feeding areas. We have to do the emergency trigger. We have to figure out, well, what would be reasonable transmission rates in the feed grounds where we don't actually have any data for CWD yet. That's the whole point, is to predict what might happen, but we can't base that on current data. Even if we had great data from other systems, it's not clear that it would be very good and applicable in this area where we're doing something completely different. So in this case, for the CWD transmission rates, we basically did that on an expert elicitation panel in a formal process where you sort of work with a panel of experts, and there's a formal way to aggregate the different opinions from those experts and then account for their relative uncertainty. We thought that was the best that can be done relative to having existing information already. And so I'm not in the expert elicitation, process, so I don't have sort of my finger on that scale of what will CWD do in this system. That's sort of shuffled out to experts, and then I just implement it in the model. We have to figure out how fed and unfed elk might infect each other within a herd unit. And then we have to figure out what would happen if you remove the feed grounds? How much might elk decline even without CWD being in the system? What's the feed ground penalty? What's the penalty for that action? And again, we don't have existing information that we can just pull from of well, we know what is going to happen. We have to sort of have an assumption about what is going to happen. And in this case, the assumption came from just what is the elk density in these areas where there are feed grounds compared to areas where we don't have feed grounds. And in fact, feed ground areas have a denser elk population in the winter than do unfed areas. And that difference is about 23%. So that's what we did. But it's an assumption. Models have assumptions. What I like about them, though, is at least we're sort of transparent in what that assumption is. And so now we can have an argument over whether that's reasonable or not reasonable. What would be a better thing to put in there? Okay, so this is what the CWD model sort of gives for us. We have, population buckets for fed elk and for unfed elk. We're monitoring them over time. It's stochastic. And fed elk, the prediction based upon, the parameters that we're largely getting from expert elicitation looks like we would go to, around 40%, whereas in unfed elk over 20 years, we'd probably go to more in the neighborhood of 20% over time. And that's if they're sort of infecting one another. Unfed elk in isolation in this model, if they weren't then, interacting with fed elk, our prediction is that it would only go to 13% by 20 years. And that's roughly in line with what we see in observational areas outside. Previous work, when we just sort of plug in vital rates around this area compared to what we think CWD mortalities would be like, they predict that elk populations would decline as soon as CWD starts to get in the 7 to 13% sort of region. And that's without hunting being layered on top of that. Wind Cave National Park, unfenced or fenced but unfed area. It has 18% in their elk population now, but in some regions of there, they have upwards of 30%. So we're predicting 40% on average in areas that are fed. We feel like that's, reasonable. Game farms with elk have much higher prevalence still. The spatial model is basically like a habitat selection model, which we then take like, what are the predicted numbers of elk, and we smear them out across space using the habitat selection type model, for which we have fed and unfed elk over time. Fed elk in the winter end up on these green spots, which are all the feed grounds. And then as like our scenarios, we can like drop out a feed ground, and then they're not there on that. Fed elk are no longer there. They're in a different feed ground, or they get lumped into the unfed group down here. There are pros and cons to many of these things, which we'll get to a little bit later about how it operates and what are the pros and cons of it. But that's sort of what the spatial model is. It's a pre-existing sort of thing, which we just tweaked around for our purposes. What you get with Forest Park, this is just some example of what we do, is like, so we get the prevalence across different alternatives, as you might expect, given what you've heard already. The feeding alternative results in the highest prevalence. The no feeding alternative is the lowest. And the intermediates are the emergency feeding and the phase outs alternatives. So not really surprising there. So now we're just sort of working with like, what is the magnitude of these differences and what is our relative uncertainty, which I'm not like showing you yet. So that's not surprising, but in all cases, the population declines. It just declines for different reasons in the different alternatives. In the feeding scenario, it declines not because you're not feeding them anymore, but it declines because of the disease consequences of feeding. And the no feeding alternative also declines. In this case, less because of disease, but also because now we've got the penalty of you're not feeding them, and so there's the penalty for that. And in this case, the magnitudes work out to be, of the same order, and our uncertainty is way bigger than like the different alternatives. Now, part of this is because Forest Park is only a couple hundred animals. And on the graph here, we're showing like 4,000 to 5,000 animals. And that's because we're doing these analyses at the herd unit level rather than at the particular feed ground level. And that's sort of more representative maybe of what a hunter would experience in October, November in their area. Do they actually observe different numbers of individuals in November in their greater region, and how much is that impacted by this one particular feed ground for which there's only a couple hundred animals there? So, what your inferences does sort of depend upon what your scale is for the analysis. And this particular analysis, we're at the herd unit level. So we go from that to then sort of assessing this consequence table, which is the ranking of all alternatives across the columns against all of your objectives. And so you're looking for what are the trade-offs here. And so one trade-off that like, all of these are sort of obvious, but now we're putting sort of relative magnitudes on those, is that feeding them reduces things related to brucellosis risk and private property damage. But no feeding them sort of maximizes the elk population size at the end. It maximizes harvest. It also maximizes a lot of the economic indicators. So it's sort of always been a little bit understood is that like there's trade-offs within the feed ground system, but all of these differences are small relative to our uncertainty in these metrics. And from this, you can't quite sort of make a decision just based upon this, because now it becomes about what is your relative importance of your different objectives. Some objectives are more important to you than others. And so that would be the next phase of this decision analysis, would be to cultivate the value of different objectives, and then you weight those objectives more. And that's then how you come up with a more optimized decision in this context. For our case, it's sort of left there for Forest Service at the moment. But then like in the back of our mind is, again, like this is just 2 of the upcoming total of 8 feed grounds. So what does that look like when we roll it up to larger and larger scale? Like, yes, our uncertainty is large here. Differences are small. Got a small number of individuals. But what happens when we roll it up to larger and larger, more and more sites? So that's what we did. This is just for one herd unit in the region, the Upper Green River unit. And so now our scenarios include like both, what if Forest Service does one thing and Game and Fish Department chooses to do another? So what you see is that Forest Service controls only part of the system. They only control the permits on their property. And so we have feeding on all feed grounds versus no feeding, but no feeding only on sites that are on Forest Service property. But Game and Fish continues to feed on all other sites, or no feeding across all sites. So this sort of gives you the understanding of what does Forest Service have control over here and what's sort of a dual control between multiple agencies. And then we also see the phase out, like with many diseases, once you get that train going, there's momentum to it. So even with a short phase out period, you still have consequences many years later of just a short term of like, we're just going to continue as normal now, just to buy a little bit of time for everybody to get ready for this thing, and then we'll phase out. Even just 3 years, basically changes our projections from 13% to 20%. And this was like, mostly done 1 or 2 years ago, and then there's going to be 2 more years of administrative issues. So probably we should have done the phase out. Like, I think we're already potentially in the phase out now. And there might be something in between for what the phase out actually is. So there's this temporal trade-off going on here. We've got this penalty of the no feeding alternative that happens right away. Short-term penalty of the no feeding, but then the lower cost of CWD over the long period of time. Whereas the continued feeding doesn't get the initial penalty, doesn't get the short-term penalty, but has the long-term consequences of higher CWD over time. And so then there's this like crossover point in all the models. And it's really just a discussion of where is that crossover point and what's your weighting of near-term versus long-term consequences. But over the longer term, the no feeding alternative ends up doing better, and that changeover point is around 10 years. At least under the assumptions of this model and to the best opinion of the experts at the moment. And then there's lots of uncertainty on top of that, but that uncertainty starts to get smaller and smaller relative to the differences between the alternatives as we roll this thing up to larger and larger scales. So we rolled that up across all of these different herd units. We did it for all the herd units except for Jackson, for all the objectives that we could do across all of the herd units at the time. And when you do that, feeding still minimizes cost to producers, but on the other metrics, no feeding is the preferred alternative. It maximizes those issues. So that's the Forest Service component of it. And now it comes back to the Jackson National Elk Refuge, which is simultaneously doing their own EIS process. Different agency, different site, unique issues of this very hard boundary between the feed ground and more intensively developed region. We have 8,000 elk instead of a couple hundred now that we're talking about. We have 600 bison that are also like part of this decision. And then we have this heavy suburban interface that's going to be problematic. So we're doing a similar thing for Elk Refuge, but is going to have a lot more different objectives than what we had to do for the Forest Service because of some of these unique things. We've got objectives about the bison. We've got things about vehicle collisions and other things that are unique to this situation compared to what we were doing for the Forest Service. So that's what I'm currently working on to do this similar process for the Elk Refuge. So my takeaways, so this is my first time really engaging in the structured decision-making process. My takeaways from it were, there are lots of pros to it. The pros that I really appreciate are that it is a merger of both the science and the values of society and of the jurisdiction of the agency. So it's not one or the other, it's a fusion of both of those things, which I appreciate. encourages transparency in how you came to a certain decision. It forces you to think through what are your objectives really, and some of those objectives are just sort of a means to another objective. So you can then remove those objectives. You don't really care about that. What you really care about is this other thing. And doing those discussions helps get you to that sort of that better place. Reduces biases, focuses on those objectives, lots of different pros here. Difficulties, I'll say, so I'm not sure there's like, another thing that I would do instead, but the difficulties that I've sort of encountered in this process were, as the technical person, you have many more assumptions that go into these models than me as a scientist typically is comfortable with. In a paper, I would never do this. But you're encountering an issue where, either I'm making those assumptions and we're working together on what they should be and they're transparently portrayed to the public, or it defaults to a manager making their own assumptions that might not be as clearly stated and you don't know where they come from. So in that light, I'll take this one, but it does make you uncomfortable sometimes, pushing you into territory where you're not used to. Embedding it in the NEPA process has a fixed timeline. So like there's lots of things that we would have liked to do, but it's like, we can't do that within the 4 months that you're giving us to do these analyses. Like I can't do all of these things. If we had a larger team, maybe we could do that, but this is what we got. So there's tension there between what biologists and managers might want to build in and then what the technical team can actually accomplish within the timeline. You tend to be optimizing for a given decision maker, but not over all consequences. Now that decision maker can weigh in other, collaborator issues, but you're optimizing it for a given agency, a given decision maker in this case. And so the way that other agencies have a role is to say, we would think that we would weight this objective importantly. And then the Forest Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service has to take that into consideration into how they weight that objective, but they might weight them differently. So it doesn't necessarily optimize across all players. It's like optimizing for the given decision maker. And then it's hard to account for things that are outside the decision maker's control. In this case, what does hunting regulations look like? What would alternatives, there could be better alternatives that are really engaging in like, well, let's hunt them down early and then let's just phase out the feed grounds so we don't have the same penalty for removing feeding. Those things are hard to do because they're not within the jurisdiction. And then another one we have a problem with is like, we work very hard with our given managers at the local level, but then some of these decisions get elevated out of that local level to higher and higher sort of like echelons of the agency. And then you've lost the process by which you came to those sort of discussions. It's then incumbent on the decision makers to sort of relay that up the line as it gets carried out of their hands to higher political sort of figures. That's certainly sort of like where the Forest Service decision is as well. Like it's partly the Forest Supervisor's decision, but it's also a discussion happening, in the DC level as well. And they didn't go through this process. They don't understand, like, why did you come to that sort of decision in the model? They don't understand the guts of quite what we've done here. So I think this is a really important moment for elk and deer in the GYE. Like by our models, like we're talking about 50–60% declines in half or so of the elk population across the system. The 75% of the elk are fed in this what is half of the ecosystem. And at the moment, there's no currently preferred alternative. Typically, Forest Service and other agencies, when they release the draft, they will say, this is what we're thinking our preferred alternative is. Now there's public comment. But right now, the draft is out and they've sort of said, we've got these 4 alternatives, but we're not saying what is our preferred alternative. We're getting public comment, and then we'll tell you what we're going to do with the record of decision. So that's the current state of affairs with Forest Service. For me, when I get sort of back to like over this course of being a seasoned researcher, how do I think about that original question of like, how do you do research that makes a difference? I've done lots of different things, some of which have had more impact than others. But sometimes I think about it in this way, where you could say model specificity, but this could also be a lab trial that's really specific or targeting a really general process. But there are lots of things down in this one corner of like, you're trying to do general principles and understand the process. Maybe doesn't have a direct application, but on the long term, you're hoping like it goes to application. But then you could get very specific, and like the structured decision making with the feed grounds is like very specific. I'm not getting like a lot of readership on that report that's outside the system, but it's directly targeting a management action now. And so I'm okay with that. And so I tend to sort of like have some sort of portfolio where I'm sort of on this axis, but I'm along the diagonal. I sort of feel like I'm not sure how you get into that upper left corner. Can you be really general and have high management application, like a natural resource management? It's hard for me to think of what those things look like. And I think there's lots of traps of where you think you might be doing applied work, but you haven't sort of fully committed to that level of really understanding what is the management's like ability to turn a lever, but yet you've made your stuff really specific. And so you've lost the general interest by making it specific, but you haven't fully committed to making it, fully engaged with the management. And so that I think is a bit of a trap area. And so I try to stay out of that area, although I'm sure I've been there too. So when I think about like my research projects and how do I grade like which research projects I'm going to do, I think many of us have like a rubric in our mind of what it is. I just wrote mine out for today. I think students start with like, can I do this project? If not, is it a useful skill for me to develop to do that project? Then you're like, well, has it been done? You go to the literature, you find like, oh no, nobody's done this ever. Like, so then as a student, that's like sort of your top two. But then you take it to like your collaborators and your PIs, and they have this additional rubric that's probably in their head. And for me, I'm then like, well, maybe there's a need for repetition, but like, what's its utility in the general knowledge? Is it important? If it's not like general, does it have a real management application? What does that look like? What are your levers again? So, but then I'm like, also, will it be fun? Because I need to be in this for the long term. How am I going to keep myself going for another 20 years? Will it be fun? If it's not fun, I might still do it, but it better be very important. So, okay, I'm like, all right, I'll do this. Is it appropriate for me? Could other people do it instead? Should they do it? Are they a better person to do it instead of me? Do I have time? Is it better than the other projects that I do? Should I shift things off of like what I'm actually doing to do this other thing? And then, other people will be like, well, where's funding in this? Like, certainly funding's in there too. Maybe that should be at the top. Maybe it's in the middle for you. I don't know, but that's like my rubric of thinking about it. How do I get to a thing of like, yes, I'm going to do this thing? But there's lots of different things where I'm like, no, don't do that thing. Doesn't fall into the rubric of what counts as being important enough to do. Like, we're all got valuable time here. You got to make sure you're using your time in a good way. So that's the rubric for me. That, I'll go to my acknowledgements.